Hey guys, John P here. Today, we're going to be talking about the luxury watch market, of course, and how the boom that we've all seen over the last handful of years is over. That's right, I believe that the big boom is now bust. But before we do that, on the wrist today, I actually have a Vacheron Constantin Overseas Gen 2 on a rubber strap. I really like this watch. You can see watches like this, but not this watch because it's in my personal collection at delraywatch.com, where we buy, sell, and trade, as well as you can find me over my Instagram, The Real John P. And I will say that the information I'm going to be sharing with you today is all based on the things that I've been seeing during buying, selling, and trading watches, especially over the last couple of months. How I've seen things kind of progress or taper down in certain ways, but also remaining strong in other categories. So how we're gonna approach this video today is I'm gonna be talking about the different types or categories of watches and giving you an update from a dealer perspective, a true indicator of kind of the volume and what it looks like compared to where it was. And perhaps you can even use this information to either find yourself a great deal on a watch that you may have been looking for, or perhaps free up a watch in your collection if you so choose, and that's what you're looking to do. So, as we know, and perhaps if you're new to watch collecting, there was a big boom, right? Big boom for these blue chip brands, Rolex, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, throughout COVID. Okay, there's a whole number of reasons why this is. We won't cover all of them, but the reality is people were buying up these watches, these hot, desirable watches like hotcakes. Truly, everyone wanted to have one. Some people wanted to flip them for higher sale prices and realize a gain in that way. And some people just wanted to have them because other people wanted to have them. There's a certain bandwagon effect in luxury goods. You see it across the boards, whether it's G-Wagons, certain types of airplanes, if you're in that type of echelon, and so on and so forth. This isn't anything new, right? But setting the stage for where we're going here, we see a tapering down when perhaps there wasn't as much of this printing money mentality, and there's a bit of a pullback to kind of control inflation, at least in the United States. And with that, consumer spending tends to go a little bit down, and we have started to see some of the effects, at least some of the effects in the more casual buyers, which does make up, believe it or not, a large percentage, if not the majority of watch buyers. If you're watching this video, very likely you're an enthusiast, much like myself. And so some things can kind of be looked through a lens of bias, right? Kind of looking at it from a collector perspective and not necessarily just someone that is looking to buy a watch because they want people to see it on their wrist, or buying a watch just because they want something nice and they want to treat themselves to something nice. So I think it's very fair for us to kind of make that distinction as well, because it's going to, I believe, really support some of the things that I'm finding here and maybe the way that you're viewing the scenario and how I explain it. So let's talk about the categories here. First, let's talk about what's going on with modern Rolex as well as modern Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and we can throw a little bit of Richard Mille in there. They're a little bit of a different kind of, I guess you would say, sub-segment of this segment, but the reality is they are kind of in there and they've seen similar kind of pullback as well. So we've seen pullback not only in the demand for these watches, but also price. Now, can you still walk into an authorized dealer and buy most Rolex? No, absolutely not. Can you walk into an authorized dealer and get that, that hot AP Royal Oak that you want? Almost certainly not. But the prices trading gray market on some of these watches like the Daytona are no longer $45,000, $50,000. You can maybe get one for $24,000, $25,000. Patek Philippe Aquanaut, like a current gen stainless steel Aquanaut, these watches were going over $100,000 now, even pre-owned, and now you can find these things floating around out there, $40,000, $50,000 in wholesale. The numbers get a little bit lower sometimes because these are watches that also have been appealing to non-enthusiasts. And when we get into the Richard Mille watches, there's been a pullback on those as well. We have one in stock at delraywatch.com at a price where, maybe 2 years ago it would have flown off the shelf, but there has been, once again, a pullback in these blue chip ultra desirable watches because those casual buyers are maybe not so focused on consumer goods or luxury goods like this at this given time. there's also a bit of a pullback in this investment mentality that essentially every online newspaper was pushing for 5 years. Hey, invest in this. Collectors are investing in this and beating the S&P. Collectors are investing in this and beating the S&P. And if you bought a $50,000 Daytona, like some of these articles, I'm not going to specifically point the finger and who told you to do that, but if you bought a 50,000 Daytona ceramic and then, now they're out there 24, 25, okay, that's not great. That's not a great investment. And so I think some of these articles have kind of backpedaled. Nonetheless, I digress. That's that category. That's what we're seeing. Still, people are buying them. People like them. People enjoy them. Enthusiasts that wished they could have bought them at more attractive prices are now kind of, picking them up at numbers that they can live with because they plan to keep the watch forever and wear it. I think that's very cool, and that's the type of buyer that we focus on at Delray Watch, and we always have since day one. The casual people that, wanted to impress their neighbor, that's not necessarily who we've focused on. So that's what I'm seeing, and I think it's very cool. So guys out there that watch these videos, thank you so much for being with us throughout the years, because it's actually gone a long way at holding our business pretty stable. Now, the next category we're going to talk about is modern other. Outside of these more desirable blue chip kind of brands where you have these casual buyers, you have the more enthusiast brands, right? You have brands like, I would say, Girard-Perregaux, Ulysse Nardin, even getting into something like Zinn watches. Omega, I think it's fair to say, yeah, people buy it outside of enthusiasts, but a very large enthusiast following. Oris, these types of watches, the demand, it might not be exactly where it was, especially with the new offerings, but in terms of pre-owned, they've actually stayed pretty well in demand. Enthusiasts have not lost their interest in collecting watches. I think in the comments sometimes you get these doom and gloomer kind of guys that say, hey, the world is ending, and everything is always ending if you look at it at a certain large enough scale, right? Everyone is always dying technically. That is true. So, it's all a matter of perspective. I know a little bit morbid here, but that kind of takes me to the point that I'm trying to say is when you look at some of the comments of people saying, hey, this is all dying. Well, look at a number that was recently published that says, the average net worth of an American is $1.1 or $1.3 million. And so, sure, that's not necessarily the median, but if you look at a number like that, there are plenty of people that are enthusiasts that, thank God, fortunately, are for themselves, but also everyone in the watch space as well. They're still interested in buying, selling, trading, and collecting watches. So when you get into the more nuanced watches that are more enthusiast focused, let's say, for example, even a York Heisek, right? Not in production, or they might have an offshoot at this point today, but nonetheless, a brand that had a bit of a heyday with their Collada line. We just sold a York Heisek perpetual calendar to like a pretty well-known actor, I would probably call them. And that's pretty surprising to me that when we start seeing signs like that of, there's still people buying, selling, trading, collecting, and they are getting into these more nuanced brands that maybe were out of the limelight in the forefront in the age of, hey, invest in Rolex, invest in Patek. That's cool for me to see, and that's always been the kind of watch that I've liked to put on my wrist, that I like to wear. Something a little bit different, something more enthusiast and conversational starter, as opposed to, oh, hey, you got a Datejust? I've got a Datejust too. We're in the Datejust club. Boring for me. Nice watches, but never been where I focus. So these other brands are staying pretty level, if not increasing in demand a little bit as people want something different, as well as there's new watch collectors every day. It's a hobby, and it's a growing hobby, so it's very cool to see. Now that takes us into vintage watches. We'll break it down, vintage Rolex or the like, maybe vintage Patek Philippe, or let's talk about, vintage Patek Philippe, vintage Rolex, throw them in the same category, pop AP in there as well, and then we'll talk about vintage other brands. The vintage Rolex market, from the perspective that I see it, now this may be different, and the numbers you see online may not be the price that the watches actually sell for, but I'm seeing a considerable dip in the pricing in vintage Rolex watches. I'm also seeing the catalogs of the watches that go up for auction get lower prices at the big auction houses that they were fetching. And I'm also seeing a lot of these vintage Rolex watches start moving out of collections and getting passed on from people that thought that maybe they would invest in them. Hey, they're not making vintage Rolex anymore, so of course this is a good investment. And maybe at a long enough time scale, that could pan out to be true, but I'm starting to see vintage Rolex watches, more of them hit the market in an effort possibly to free up some funds, either from dealers or collectors or pseudo dealers, for example. So now is actually a pretty great time, in my opinion, to get yourself into a vintage Rolex watch if perhaps the last 3 or 4 years, the numbers got out of control. And I think if you hunt around, you can find some really great deals in this category, vintage subs, vintage GMT masters. They're a pretty good deal right now, I'll say. Not the best time to sell one from your collection if you were waiting, but a great time to perhaps add one to your collection. Now, and the same kind of goes for some of the other, let's say, Patek Philippe models and Audemars Piguet, vintage Royal Oaks. The numbers have come down considerably. Let's set aside the vintage Royal Oak A series, which is, that ultra premium collector. Let's talk about first Royal Oaks. But, setting aside some certain rare examples, yep, great time for those watches as well. And that's going to take us into a talking point of vintage watches outside of, the Rolex, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet. Vintage watches, there has been a pullback as well, much like vintage Rolex, but it's not as big of a pullback as we're seeing in something like modern Rolex, for example, or modern Patek Philippe. But there's enough pullback to where, maybe people are focusing their purchasing on modern brands that they think are a bit of a better deal today. And there was this bit of a trickle over, I would say, for collectors that wanted vintage Rolex or vintage Patek, vintage AP, but maybe the numbers kind of got out of control. So then they kind of, they deferred over into vintage Omega, for example, vintage Tag Heuer, or vintage Heuer rather. And these kind of areas, vintage Omega, vintage Tag Heuer, they're not doing too well, but they haven't seen as big of a pullback as, modern Rolex or modern Patek Philippe. People still want them. They're just moving a little bit slower because, once again, this is kind of enthusiasts that are focused maybe on something else in their collection outside of things that they were kind of just deferring to because the watches that they wanted were at very high premiums. But overall, vintage, from what I hear and what we see at Del Rey Watch, it kind of seems to have reached a level that perhaps is pre-COVID era, right? I'm not saying that COVID had anything necessarily to do with it, but the period of time where we saw this boom, now it's kind of tapered back and it's at more of a level where enthusiasts, I believe, can take advantage of some better numbers. Now, that being said, there still could be some downside to any of these categories, or there could be upside, right? A lot of these things rely on factors certainly out of my control, but out of control of most people, at least exclusively. A lot of different moving parts, regionality, parts of the world, elections, wars, ongoing, so forth. You get the idea. So it could go either way, but I see a bit of a leveling out across the board in these things. And I think it's fair to say the boom is over, but there could be a little bit downside. But I think it's fairly safe to perhaps get into something that you've been waiting on the sidelines. But I want to know what you have to say about this. Do you agree with this? Perhaps do you see something a little bit different? Do any of you track any specific models or references that maybe you've been on the fence on, or maybe you'd like to sell? Things like that. I'd love to see your perspective in the comments below. Guys, to wrap this up, just wanted to say this has been what I've been seeing at Del Rey Watch, as well as some chatter between other dealers. And I do recognize that Del Rey Watch is very fortunate because we have such loyal collectors like all of you out there that have worked with Federico and myself for years now at this point. So I want to thank you once again for being with us. And I do recognize that every dealer or company that buys and sells watches is in a little bit of a different situation depending on a whole number of things. So I do want to provide that disclaimer that it could be different just depending on the dealer. So guys, thanks again. We'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P.